conveniently located outside the jurisdiction of Herod Antipas and the Jerusalem temple authorities. Pella and Magadan Park became important locations in Jesus' public work for the same reason. From bases of operations set up in these locations, Jesus and his followers could launch evangelistic missions into neighboring territory and then return to safety when the hostility of the religious authorities became too great. The encampment on Mount Gilboa became a turning point in the work of the kingdom. John the Baptist, working from prison, had appointed 12 apostles, and these 12, led by Abner, met in conference on Mount Gilboa with the apostles of Jesus led by Andrew. They camped here and worked for 3 weeks to coordinate divergent efforts, to compose differences of opinion, to plan joint preaching tours, to establish financial strategy, and to socialize their personal religious practices. Jesus refused to participate, insisting that he was the representative of the Father to the individual, not the group. He encouraged the two groups to work out their differences as best they could. Neither could they get Jesus to comment on the ritual of baptism, a matter of great contention between the two groups. Baptism was the price which the followers of Jesus paid to keep the followers of John with them. In early November, the two groups moved across the Jordan Valley to Pella. They set up a headquarters for joint operations. By now, Jesus had successfully taken over the infrastructure of John's movement. Abner had become a devout believer in Jesus and a tireless worker for the kingdom. Pella is located in a tiny valley with a perpetual spring between two hills. In the 1st century, the Romans had begun a slow rebuilding of the urban center. The town itself appears to have occupied the northern hill at the time. To the southwest, less than a mile from the city center, is a large open space with a natural amphitheater. This space opens onto the Jordan Valley and the place where the Roman road crossed the Jordan River, connecting the Mediterranean coast with the inland route to Mesopotamia. This was the route over which thousands traveled from distant lands to meet Jesus and hear his message. From Pella, the 24 quietly worked the northern Decapolis. They went in pairs, the apostle of John baptizing, while the apostle of Jesus did the teaching. They worked for 10 weeks until that day when word came to the Pella camp that John had been executed by order of Herod Antipas. Jesus called the 24 together and said, "John is dead. Herod has beheaded him. There shall be delay no longer. The hour has come to proclaim the kingdom openly and with power. Tomorrow we go into Galilee." When Jesus arrived back in Capernaum, he was accompanied by his administrative group of 12 well-trained teachers, plus 25 of the former disciples of John. They immediately began a tour of central Galilee, preaching in all the major towns as well as the small villages in between. The effort lasted for 2 months.
The world in which they worked has changed in many ways over the past 2,000 years. Ancient roads the early evangelists traveled have been transformed into modern transportation routes. Herod's capital of Tiberias has become a bustling modern city. Nazareth has become a major urban center, spread over the hills that surrounded the 1st century town. The Nazareth hillside likely contained agricultural terraces in addition to structures. Today, just below the crest of the highest hill is a Catholic school and the Church of the Adolescent Jesus. At the top of the hill is a small park. The rector of the church thought that there was no way any active boy growing up in Nazareth would not have climbed this hill and played on it. To the south lies the fertile Jezreel Valley. Here were towns such as Megiddo, Nain, Endor. At Magdala, a major new tourist center is under construction. The excavations here are uncovering what likely was the largest city on the lake in Jesus' time. Here, a narrow street runs through a residential area. On either side are homes, many of which had ritual baths. One of the few synagogues clearly dating to the 1st century is being excavated here. This small, simple synagogue may be representative of the synagogues encountered by Jesus and the 12 in many of the Galilean cities and towns. A newly excavated square reveals the port of Magdala and the 1st century level of the lake. The lake level today is about 10 feet lower. A line of trees reveals an earlier shoreline. Several years ago, during a drought, the level of the lake dropped sufficiently to reveal a boat from the 1st century embedded in mud and silt. The boat was said to have been built by a master craftsman, and based on its size, most likely was the type which would have been used by Jesus and the 12. Jotapata may be taken as an example of many other Galilean cities of the period. During the times of the Hasmonean conquests, a century before Jesus, its population had become increasingly Jewish. Some 14 kilometers north of Nazareth, the site of Cana occupies another abandoned hilltop. Gamla, the Machu Picchu of Israel, was on a remote mountain peak just to the east of the lake. It was destroyed following a brutal siege by the Romans in 67 AD and never resettled. It is one of very few locations left undisturbed since the 1st century. From the city, the Sea of Galilee could be seen some 17 kilometers to the west, with Capernaum on the northern shore.
At the end of March AD 28, Jesus, Abner, and the entire group made their way south to Jerusalem for Passover. Jesus intended to keep a low profile and do no public teaching. He set up headquarters at Bethany in the home of his childhood friends, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. But the number of people coming to see him quickly grew so large that they moved to the Garden of Gethsemane, setting up a camp just outside the city. Here they met and talked with hundreds of inquirers from distant lands. After a month of work, it was decided that Abner and the disciples of John would go south and work in the towns and villages of Judea. Jesus and the 12 would return to Galilee. The response to the first preaching tour of Galilee had been so great that Jesus now set up a training camp on the lakeshore near Bethsaida, just south of Capernaum. Here he and the apostles trained more than 100 evangelists between May and October of AD 28. It was from this group that the 70 mentioned in the Gospel of Luke eventually were drawn. The first public preaching tour of Galilee had focused on the central part of the region. The second tour focused on the major towns and countless villages in the southern and eastern parts. This mission lasted for 3 months. Out over the roads and trails of Galilee, Jesus sent the apostles and more than 100 graduates from the Bethsaida Training School in teams of 2. David Zebedee, brother of James and John, had set up a messenger service employing more than 40 runners who kept the various teaching groups in contact. These runners traversed these rugged roads as well. In all his teaching, Jesus focused